Hello.
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 Yo,
How we doing, Theo?
Isaac, how are you, sir?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, man. Looking good.
I'm gonna say the same for you, baby. Keeping it tight. I like it.
Yeah, what I mean, who needs all this? Right? Uh no, I would kill for some of that stuff, but
No,
I got
it's like yeah, that looks good, baby.
I love the wall too, man. Let me got your Zoom setup working.
Trying.
Yeah.
Year 3, I figured I might as well get it together.
Yeah, I'm still just winging it here. I'm trying to stay comfortable in these chairs.
I'm just fine. I was so excited to come into the classroom. It's just it really felt like it changed so quickly there in December. Such a bummer again.
Yeah, it was really wild. We did a whole semester in person, and we had every intention of doing this in person. And then, we sort of took a poll last minute, and folks were like, wanting to stay home. The one good thing is you get to see, these weird trade-offs we make now. You do get to see faces. You get to see expressions and smiles and emoting in ways like, with the mass, you sort of have the trade-off. You're in person, but like maybe they're smiling, or maybe they're just cleaning their teeth or something. It's like who knows what's going on down there. So at least we get the bright smiling faces.
I like that. I like that optimism. And yeah, I have a feeling, not for too long here in this time around.
Yeah.
Knock on wood. I'll knock on wood. I don't want to jinx them.
So yeah, sorry we ran a little over. Oh, not too bad. We're kind of on time. We've just been furiously workshopping stuff. Yeah, I think, let's see, this is about the group. We got two workshop groups going simultaneous, one more on the genre side, and one more on the short story, poetry, that kind of stuff.
I love it.
So yeah, I would love to hear about how things are going, what the new adventures in writing, publishing, and got such an interesting career path. I feel like, I don't know if I don't know, do folks have the origin story? Let's let's see. Maybe we hit the origin story today.
Yeah, I feel like I recognize a couple of faces there. But yeah, if it's not too boring, basically, I don't, if most people don't have it, I'd be happy to do kind of the how I got to where I am today story.
The radioactive spider, yeah. The spider.
Yeah, exactly. If people don't feel like this is like the third time hearing it. And then of course, as always, just very happy to answer any and all questions, kind of talk about what's going on nowadays, because that is the interesting thing, Theo. I've been doing, these talks with you for so long now that it's like there's new chapters that have been added.
Yeah, it's for real. Different mediums, different, real, some hard writing and some fun writing, and just like, yeah, it's always great to hear how the path you're blazing, and
yeah, trying to make it happen. So yeah, I'll just jump right into it. And then again, like I said, happy to answer any and all questions at the end. For me, the main thing is not to we'll like, basically I like to start like kind of the very beginning, because I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and my parents were we basically lived in this place called the Catholic Worker, which was a socialist Catholic homeless shelter that basically it was at part soup kitchen, part low income housing. My parents were married when they had me, just to different people. And so that, and I won't lie, I think like from a very early age, whether it be the Boston storytelling Irish background that I was coming from, whether it be growing up in that soup kitchen where people are always telling stories. I was always hearing people tell stories. I think at a very young age, I knew that I had a good first line in that. My parents were married when they had me just to different people. So basically, you know, they were out on their asses a little bit, if you'll excuse my language, and they didn't have a place to go. They didn't have a home. So I grew up in this very unique environment. But the thing is when you're a kid, you don't know that it's a very unique environment, right? So I grew up in the soup kitchen, surrounded by like all of these kind of characters and just kind of wonderful people. Obviously, some of them going through some real hardships as well. And you know, I basically I love to ask people about their stories. I love to interview people, and I think that came from being a very curious kid in this particular setting. And so I was in the setting. I was always talking to these folks. You know, don't get me wrong. Some people were always very happy to talk to me. This one guy, Albert, used to always slip me butterscotches. My mom would then have me slip them straight to her because Albert was like maybe 100 years old and those butterscotches were probably about 95 years old. But then also, you know, I'm sure I was also pretty annoying to some people. I'm sure they were like a little hungover, a little bit like, get this goddamn kid away from me. But so I grew up there. And eventually my parents, basically the Catholic worker has these soup kitchens. They have these, you know, intermittent for houseless people, like low-key housing situations. And then they actually had like apartments and buildings that they would try to rent out for low-income families that were trying to get back up on their feet. So eventually my mom and my dad and I end up in one of those. And that is, you know, that is like basically the first decade of my life is living in that group, in always going back to the soup kitchen. And it, you know, it was like not the easiest neighborhood. It was the South End. It was the 80s. It's a much different neighborhood now. Very classy, very nice. But like I got mugged when I was 8 at gunpoint. The gentleman did apologize to me. I think that's probably because he saw that I'd wet my pants, which I didn't realize I'd done yet. Until he like took off. I was like, oh. There's a shooting on my front streets. Just like a lot of stuff that eventually I think got my parents a little bit, okay, is this truly a safe environment for our kid? And then also, let's be honest, they were starting to have their own troubles 8 years in. When you're a kid, that's your whole life. When you're an adult, you know, that's kind of, you know, that's, they're trying to make things work, but things are tough and they're getting tougher. So eventually my parents separate and my mom and I move out to rural Massachusetts. And so that's basically the kind of my first step is like, I've known one way of life. I've known a very, very inner city way of life. And then all of a sudden we moved to basically the middle of nowhere. And the joke that I like to tell for those folks that know Massachusetts is I'm like, oh, you know, if you go like far enough west in Massachusetts, it gets like really pretty. And everyone's like, yeah, the Berkshires, beautiful. I'm like, well, before that, it was north central Massachusetts. It's basically like, there's cities up there, Worcester, you know, Holyoke, Springfield. Those were places like Fitchburg, Leominster. I traveled, those were like my cultural meccas. I had to travel like 45 minutes to an hour just to get to those. I was in the hills in the middle of nowhere in a town called Athol, Massachusetts, which is, you know, we understand probably what kids in the rest of the state called Athol, Massachusetts, and that's that they called it asshole Massachusetts. It was, you know, same story of a lot of different areas and all throughout the country. Basically, there used to be a bunch of mills. It was a river town, hill town, bunch of industry, which eventually moved down south and then eventually moved out of the country altogether, leaving, you know, basically a low income, very rural area. My grandparents on my mother's side, you know, we all have parents, different family situations, but never the best idea maybe to live right next to your parents if they're overbearing people and you're going through like another divorce after having, you know, all I'm trying to say is my mom was having a tough time. And so we lived like, but they had a farm. So that was like again, just like I'm going from this incredibly inner city situation to like, you know, there's a ton of sheep all of a sudden in my life. There are chores to be done. Definitely no corner stores around. So it was, you know, it was a very jarring, it was a very wild, but at the same, like, you know, I basically couldn't leave my block where I grew up in the city. And then all of a sudden now they just like would let me wander around for miles in the woods. But with that being said, eventually my parents start like working on things a little bit. Eventually my dad moves out, but and without getting into too much of the family history, just know like things are pretty hard. And at that point, my home life becomes just a little difficult. It becomes a little, again, my parents are trying their best, but I think they're having a hard time in life, and it's, you know, being taken out in the household. And so I start to kind of act up, and that's around age 12. I start to become kind of when they start to get their act together, to be honest, is when I start to like really become a little bit of a hellion. And that includes basically the middle school that I went to. It's a very rural area, not a lot of kids actually. So a lot of the towns had to, you know, all go to one school. And basically they had a middle school and a high school. It was all lumped together. So I was a 12-year-old, but I had friends who were 18, kind of became like a little bit of a mascot for the kids, driving around in trucks, having a real fun time, of course, but maybe not the exact picture of an angel, of a wonderful kid. But the one thing that I did do, and again, I credit this to my parents, and this goes all the way back to Boston. Even when we were in that situation, they always took me to the library. They always made sure books were around. They absolutely made sure that I was a reader. So I was constantly reading, just constantly inhaling whatever books I could get my hands on. And that meant that education, which was very important to my parents, that was something that they passed down to me. No matter how much I was messing up, no matter how much trouble I was getting into, I always tried to keep my grades up. I always, you know, I knew that basically half of that was just showing up at school. I had a lot of friends that would always skip. I always tried to at least show up. You know, was I doing the reading of the classes? Probably not, but I was doing some readings. Let's be honest, like the school librarian really liked me, and that's partially because she had a kid named Chad and we were buddies, but that's a whole other story. My other best friend, Liam, his mom was a librarian. It's basically what I'm trying to say is a lot of librarians looked out for me over the course of my life, and I really appreciate that. But so this is all happening. I start to get decent grades, and at the same time, my home life is starting to get a little rougher and rougher. And I think the adults in my life at that school started to notice, which I am very, very fortunate for, because that is definitely one part of the story for me is just like, the best way to put it is like the luck of somebody caring. And so I was lucky enough to have some people at that school who noticed that things were going wrong, and who started to try and give me options at a very young age. So basically in 7th, 8th grade, I'm like 12, 13 years old. It becomes apparent to me that there's a boarding school, not right around the corner, but not super far away either. And what they like to do is they actually like to take a kid out of the community. They give them a full scholarship. Again, when you think about it, with the breadth of history, you basically are realizing like basically they're trying to buy off the local towns so that they didn't all just like come and, you know, burn the school to the ground because it's filled with a bunch of rich kids from all other places of the world. But luckily I applied for that boarding school scholarship and I got it. And that really changed my life. So at the age of 14, I am able to leave my household, which was again, a difficult place to be at that time. And I got to go to a school that gave me a really, really wonderful education. I want you to know that the summer before I went to that school, I like really tried to lay back on all my bad behavior, only to show up at that school and then of course realize, oh wait, rich kids are also can be difficult and like to have their own fun as well. And so that was an interesting moment for me. So, you know, I got to go from kind of inner city to rural, but then I also got to kind of do a class jump, which was I basically was always growing up in a very low income situation. All of a sudden I started making friends. Again, I thought it was going to be like, oh, and now I'm going to this place where everyone's going to be perfectly behaved and all prim and proper. And all of a sudden I realized like, no, some of these rich kids are total. And I went in with a huge chip on my shoulder, but then eventually I'm like, oh, some of these rich kids are really jerks. But then I would also be like, oh, but some of them are actually kind of nice. And then I'd be going home a little bit and I'd hang out with friends from home and I'd be like, oh, some of my friends are great. But then also understand like, oh, actually some of them are jerks. At this point, like I'd never been on a plane. I hadn't been out of the state much. And all of a sudden I'm going to a school where literally kids came, not just from all around the country, but all around the world. So I was starting to get my eyes open into all sorts of different things. And I'd be going back to my friends in my small town, and you know, some of them would be saying stuff. I was like, wait, this isn't computing. So I got to get all these kinds of different stories and all these different people in my life, and it really broadened my horizons. One fun story from that is just fun to tell, just to share, just while we're shooting the shit, like to give an example of what's going on in my life. So again, I'm coming from a place, Athol, Massachusetts. I'm like, when I'm 16 years old, when I was like 12 and 13, I was working at the country store. I basically started working when I was 12 years old. I get to boarding school. I immediately go to the local Cumbies, which is, it's off campus, but we could walk down there, and I applied for a job and I got it. And I showed back up and the teacher was like, you can't have a job. Like, what is going on? Like, you can't just do that. That's not how it works here. Eventually they worked it out because you get a scholarship, but that doesn't give you like walking around money, So eventually they worked it out that I could like work at the school dish washing situation. Summers off, I would work at like Friendly's at this place called Gardner, which was like around the corner from the school. So I'm like a dishwasher at a Friendly's, which is like, if you're unfamiliar, it's like an ice cream diner situation. But then all of a sudden, like that year, it's my sophomore year, I play on the JV2 basketball team. JV2 basketball team is exactly what it sounds like. Are we varsity? We're not. Are we JV? We're not. We're worse than JV. There's only one basketball court, so we were allowed to like, practice for about 45 minutes every afternoon before the other teams needed it because they were much more important, which was great for us actually, because we just wanted to like go smoke cigarettes in the woods anyways. But one person that I would go on big runs with and we would go smoke cigarettes in the woods, one day his name was Jigme, and he sat me down. He said, Isaac, I want to tell you a secret. And I said, what, Jigme? He said, I'm the Crown Prince of Bhutan, which is a small country in between India and China. And I said to Jigme, I want to tell you a secret. He said, what? I said, everybody knows that. Because literally you live in your own separate house off campus, like the JV2 team gets in buses and you have your own car. But anyways, it's just to get like, it was a wild mind altering experience to have something like that happen. But then again, because I'm young at that point, I know that this is different for sure than most of the things that I've experienced, but still young enough to think like, okay, this is what's happening. But anyway, same thing happens at boarding school, which is I'm reading all the time. I'm keeping up on my schoolwork. I'm a little bit of a troublemaker. Basically that next summer I get a job at a hotel that's on an island, which means I'm out of my house completely at the age of 16, which I think was very good for my parents and very good for myself. And to be honest, like up until right before I go to that school, I wasn't even planning on going to college. And then thanks to that school, I was able to go to college. I got a scholarship. That was very helpful. Exact same thing happens, except in college, at least I'm allowed to have a job. But, I get to school, still not quite knowing what I want to do with my life. I'm just reading all the time. The school's in Washington, D.C. So I say, okay, politics. So I go for politics. At the time, I'm like working at bars and restaurants just to pay the bills. Eventually, I get a job as an assistant investigator at the Department of Justice doing ADA, American Disabilities Act, civil liberties division, like wild stuff. But like none of it speaks to me. Like God bless folks that work on that stuff. But for me, it's just like, oh, it's not clicking. But I graduate. So a friend has a job with to help a guy get elected to Congress. I'm 23. I'm like, all right, let's do that. The money's nothing. It was basically that, or I've written an essay about this. There's another friend was in New York. He's like, move to New York and we can sell cocaine. I'm pretty happy I didn't do that one. But I do this politics one, let me tell you, like basically again, no money, just trying to figure out how this works. The guy was not supposed to win. We do win, but like the reward was just to do it all over again. Like it didn't make any sense to me. And at that point, I just like pick up, leave, and move to San Francisco. I'd been painting houses like right after college in New Hampshire. I'd met somebody there. She'd moved out to New Hampshire. I'm sorry, out to San Francisco. I'm like, all right, I'm going to follow her. There's a point here. Trust me. So I follow her. I get to San Francisco. I think immediately she's like, all right, you got to get like, ooh, for the record, she had like 5 roommates in like a 1-bedroom. I'm like, hey, I'm here now. That's 6 people. That's too many. She's like, we got to get you out of the house a little bit. I get a job at Buca de Beppo, which is like the Olive Garden, but worse. And basically then she's like, hey, I saw a sign. I know you like books a lot. I saw a sign. It said bookmaking and storytelling workshop. Why don't you head down to that? And I say, okay. And so I walk to that. And that's like, that is one of these like life-changing moments for me, because at this point, I'm 23 years old. I've had a lot of luck in my life. And, I don't want to diminish what I've accomplished either. I worked really hard, but I truly don't have a lot of direction. And I walk into this place, it's called 826 Valencia. And, you know, we're here in New York, there's an 826 NYC, just to be clear. But this was the first one. They've got them now in Michigan, and there's one in New Orleans, and let's see, there's one in Boston, there's one in LA. They're a bunch now, but this was the first one. It's called 826 Valencia. That was just the address, Valencia Street in San Francisco. And I walk in, and it's a pirate supply store, which is, I know it sounds wild, but I'm not talking like plastic and gimmicky and like Halloween. I'm talking like they had like metal doubloons and ropes everywhere. And it looked like kind of a magical place. And then in the back, there was like a big room with a giant table and all these writing implements. And they're like, oh, come in, come in, come in. And that's when I realized, like, basically this is like an open house situation. And in my mind, I'm like, all right, I love stories. I love books. Let's see what this storytelling and bookmaking workshop's all about. And I sit down, and it becomes immediately apparent that this is for kids. And what they are doing is trying to train adults to be volunteers, to work with the kids. It's an after-school program. It's free to any kids in the community. We help with homework, but also we help them learn how to write. We help them make their own books. There was like a little bookbinding press there, all this wonderful stuff. But I'm 23 years old, still a bit of a jerk, let's be honest. And at that point, I was like, wait, this is for kids. This is to help kids. I don't know if I want to be volunteering my time. But you can't really get up and walk out 5 minutes into a meeting like that. You know what I'm saying? People are gonna be like, that's a jerk. And I at least had enough self-knowledge in that moment to know that that's what would happen. So I stuck around, and the more they talked, the more interesting I became. The more interested I became in it, the more interesting it seemed to me. And at that point, that's when I noticed there were all of these pages, all of these single pages with typed, sometimes handwritten, but then all over them was definitely just a bunch of handwriting, sometimes red, sometimes blue, but just a bunch of markings. And they were all framed, and they went in a circle around the room. And I just like kind of raised my hand during a question part. And I said, what are those? And they said, oh, well, okay, so 826 Valencia was started by an author. His name's Dave Eggers. And he also started this publishing house called McSweeney's. And these pieces of paper are all from different manuscripts from Dave's friends, who are also writers, and every page is from a manuscript that actually got turned into a book. But the point of them is to show the kids that writing, while it is a very singular art form, often benefits from community, which is to say, whether it be an editor or a family member or a teacher or a friend, but you can give your story to somebody else. And you know what? You don't have to take all of their feedback, but you can get their edits, you can get their feedback, and that will improve their work. And I'm 23 years old, and I'm like, yes, let's teach 8-year-olds this. Because up until that point, I really hadn't, as much as I loved books, I really hadn't thought about where they came from. And I think that's partially because, again, like I said, I was growing up in Boston. I was in the library a lot. A lot of what I was reading, we're talking like, let's just call it what it is. There was a lot of old white men. There was a lot of the classics. There was a lot of that going on. Even as I get educated throughout, I hadn't really thought about contemporary. Like, I was like, wait, people are still doing this? Like, people are still, this, like, writing can be a job? And I didn't realize that. And all of a sudden I discovered this place that was there to basically teach and inspire 8-year-olds that was the case. And I immediately started volunteering there, basically along with the 8-year-olds, got very inspired, and really learned that second lesson, that the part of those papers, is that it's really important to find your community, to find your people, to find folks who can give you feedback on things. Because again, up until that moment, I thought a writer, like, I thought it was a gift from God or the universe, whatever you want to call it. I thought it was just like a writer of the books that I grew up with. They just like had this gift. They had this special power. And I thought it was like God had kind of touched them. And then they got to live in like an ivory tower, and they just typed perfect prose, and then they printed it out, and they like sent it to New York, and then they became millionaires. All of which now I know is not true, especially the millionaires part, even the most successful people. But that was the first time that I realized it could be seen as a craft. When I grew up, when I was in rural Massachusetts, we used to work on cars all the time. This was the first time somebody had talked about it as like, you know, my buddy Corey opening up his truck and showing me the engine for the first time. And I'm just like, I don't know what any of that is. It just looks like a mess to me. But then eventually you can have somebody that can kind of teach you, oh, this is what this is, and this goes here. And it's a craft and you can work on it. And just like practicing a sport or practicing anything, the more that you work at it, perhaps the better you will get. And that is a great lesson for 8-year-olds. And it was a wonderful lesson that I learned at 23. And immediately through that organization, and again, if you do find yourself with spare time, I highly recommend the 826 programs. And I know there are other programs like them in New York, because it's just a wonderful place where like you're helping the community, you're helping kids, there's art. So, you know, you just got that kind of alive feeling, but also you will meet other adults who are interested in this kind of stuff. And so that is through 826 and eventually McSweeney's, the publishing house. I started meeting other people who had these similar interests in writing, in books. I immediately started journaling, which was, to be honest, something I'd never done before. Basically, aside from some really bad poetry in high school, like I'd never even really tried writing, but all of a sudden I was like, okay, I gotta just start somewhere. So I just kind of started. And at the same time, don't get me wrong, I'm still working in bars and restaurants a bunch. Eventually I do end up working at McSweeney's for a short stint and 826 Valencia. I won't lie, I worked at that pirate supply store for a little bit. That was a great job. That's a fun one. We'll get to that in a little bit because it'll come up in my kids' book. But you know, it became like a center for me where I started building community. And that's where the next thing what came out of that was I started working on this online culture magazine called The Rumpus. We started it out there in San Francisco, and that was like this next step for me because it was so important. Basically, there was the San Francisco literary community. It's a small city, you know, less than 1 million people. You know, if you include the whole Bay Area, definitely 4 million larger for sure, but you know, nothing compared to New York. And so it's this smaller community, but all of a sudden we start this online website, and that's when we start being able to connect with people all over the country, from other countries, basically realizing like, hang on a second, if you find people both in your area, in your neighborhood, in your city, but you can also find people thanks to the internet, and you can actually form communities and start to work on things together. And what happened at the Rumpus was incredible and lucky. And I got to work with some really incredible writers before they became household names. We had a anonymous advice column called Dear Sugar, which was actually written by Cheryl Strayed, who would go on to, Dear Sugar would become collected into a book called Tiny Beautiful Things, but her big book was Wild, which would then get turned into a movie by Reese Witherspoon. Roxanne Gay was writing essays for us. That would, you know, a lot of those ended up in Bad Feminist. Eventually she went on to become our essays editor. So I got to work with her a bunch. My best friend and a wonderful poet, Saeed Jones, I got to publish some of his early essays, some of his early poetry on the site. And again, just for the record, money, not a lot, let's be honest. We started throwing monthly events that I'd basically pass the hat at. And that was basically, I just hoped that was enough to cover the rent. A lot of ramen in those days. Not the nice go into the restaurant kind, you know what I'm talking about, the plastic packets. But we did it and we loved it. And again, it led to this sense of community. And at that point, I met this wonderful illustrator. Her name was Wendy McNaughton. And she's gone on to illustrate. There's this wonderful cookbook you might know of. It's called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. It's a huge success. She's amazing. At the time, she was working on a series called Meanwhile. And meanwhile, she went to like the San Francisco Public Library. She went to like different neighborhoods, and she would do all these drawings of anything she saw, but she could only use words that she overheard. She couldn't write her own words. She would only, basically, she'd build a little comic story out of words and images that she saw and then drew or heard and then wrote down. And she wanted to do one about the bars, the Mission bars. And as I've mentioned a couple of times here, I was working in bars a lot. Let's be honest, the money earned in those bars often got spent in those bars as well. And Wendy McNaughton came to me and she said, hey, I heard, at that point, we knew each other through the website. We were publishing her work on the website. She said, hey, I've heard you're the guy that if I want to do like a meanwhile all about the Mission bars, that you like know everyone and you could walk me through them. And I was like 100%, I will be your guide. And so I walked her through. We had an absolute blast. And I loved working on the project with her. And at the end, she basically was like, if you have any ideas for anything you ever want to collaborate on, let me know. And at that point, I'd worked in the bars, and a lot of the ways that we would pass time during downtime was we would tell each other the stories behind our tattoos. And I just said to her, I was like, what if I ask people about their stories of their tattoos, and then you because tattoos are their own art form, but I was like, and you kind of redraw the art form of the tattoo artist, and we'll see how it goes. And this is the point of the story again. It's just like, there was no idea. There was no, like, we weren't doing it for a purpose. We just thought it was a fun project to work on. At the time, Tumblr was something that people were very excited about. So we just started posting these things on Tumblr. And that is how she and I got our first book, which is basically, she had an agent already. And we were doing this Tumblr, but it got a lot of success and a lot of people were talking about it. And so eventually it became our first book, which was called Pen and Ink, Tattoos and the Stories Behind Them. Got Cheryl to write a little introduction. It was very helpful. That was like right when she was blowing. I was like, it was like the last favor I could ask Cheryl for. And it's funny enough, I just opened her page. Cheryl is herself also in there. And basically, Wendy would do these beautiful, beautiful illustrations, kind of these redrawings of the tattoos. And I would talk to people about, their reasons for getting them. And some of them are very heartfelt. Some of them are bears on skateboards. And it goes back to that kind of that time when I was in the homeless shelter as a kid. I'm very interested in other people. I love talking to them about their stories. So this got collected into Pen and Ink. Around that time, Saeed Jones, who I mentioned earlier, had actually become the LGBT editor at BuzzFeed, going on to become BuzzFeed News. And they needed a books editor. That was a huge opportunity for me. He lined me up for that. Again, very lucky and very, kind of reaping rewards from the community that I was a part of that meant so much to me. But then I got to move to New York, which was, to be honest, always the dream. It was, I'm not gonna lie, I know there's a lot of Boston kids that got a chip on their shoulder, but I can admit to it. I always wanted to get to this city. This was the city I always wanted to get to, and I'm jealous of those that got to grow up here. Everyone in my life, girl I moved to San Francisco for, she grew up in New York. That's all I'm saying. Just cool people come from New York, and it's a fun place. So I was very excited to get an opportunity to move here. That was 8 years ago. So I get an opportunity to move here again, get an opportunity to basically talk about books online and get paid for it. A lot? No. When I moved to New York, were there some rude awakenings? Oh, there were. One being, I worked in San Francisco for so long, I almost lived there for a decade, where I would get a lot of, all my friends were restaurant owners and bartenders and stuff. So, the drinks were, I'd get some inexpensive stuff. I got to New York and I ordered my first drink and it was like $15. And I was like, oh no, I gotta save money in this town. But I figured it out. Like, don't get me wrong, for a while, it's also about knowing the city better, right? It's just like about not being an idiot new kid to it. Like literally for a while though, it felt like I had to take like $50. You know how you like put it in a $1 bill to get like a candy machine thing situation? It felt like it was like a shredder on my door. I just put $50 in it just to leave the house, is how it felt there in those first couple of years, where it was just like burning through money. But eventually the job works out. I get to keep doing what I love doing, which is talking about books online. And in that way, also building community, and then also being here in New York, all of a sudden I get to meet with different publishers. I get to meet with different editors. I get to meet people like Theo and have other opportunities like open up and get to know more writers and build that community. Around that time, Wendy and I published our second book, which is Knives and Ink, Chefs and the Stories Behind Their Tattoos with Recipes. That's because we had so many people apply for the first. The first one is just anyone. There's people from all walks of life in the first one. But we had so many chefs that we basically decided to do a specific chef book. And again, it's the exact same thing, where she just did some beautiful illustrations and we get the stories there behind them. And so like at that point, things feel kind of amazing. I won't lie. At this point, I'm in my 30s. I mean, I still am, but this is my early 30s. And it feels like I've actually kind of figured out what to do, which is I've always loved books. I'm learning how to build community. I'm figuring out how to make a living talking about books online. But let's be honest, the dream was to always try to be a writer. And even these books that I'm doing, I love them and I'm very proud of them, but really I'm taking other people's stories down and I'm editing them is what I'm doing in these. I wanted to create my own. So if you can bear with me for like 5 more minutes, then I promise I'll wrap it up so we can ask questions. Basically, I start writing essays. I start writing personal essays, and I start grappling with a few of the things from my childhood. I start grappling with a few of the things from my 20s. I start trying to explore different choices I've made in my life and the different ways I've reacted to that childhood. And I feel very lucky to do that. And we'll pick that up in just a second. But another thing that happens, which again, just involves everything I'm talking about, which is community, a little bit of luck, community, and opening yourself to, letting other people help you, and collaboration. Another thing that happens, which is an only in New York story, is I move into the house I live in now. And just for the record, I've lived at the same apartment for 8 years now, making it the single longest I have lived anywhere, including my childhood. I've lived in this house now longer than I've lived anywhere else for these 8 years. I know it's 10 years before you can like officially become a New Yorker, but I'm feeling very good about being here in New York and this apartment. But so I move into this apartment in my backyard. I'm looking out right now. There's a window right there. Early on, I'm going out there. There's a guy in the back. He's drinking a little rosé. I'm drinking a little rosé. We get to talking through the fence, just chatting. Happens a couple of times over the course of a few months. Eventually, he's like, hey, you got to come over to the house. It's right around the block. I come over to the house. We get to know each other more. Eventually, it's not like I had no idea who he was. He had no idea who I was. But I eventually figure out that he is John Sheska, who's an incredible children's book writer. In the 90s, he wrote a book called, The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Fairly Rotten or Stupid, I can't quite remember, fairy tales. And then he also did this book about the Three Little Pigs, but it's told from this point of view of the Big Bad Wolf. Basically, yeah, John, like just incredible classic books. Love them so much. And I'm like, holy crap. Now, of course, at that point in my life, I had an idea for a kid's book bouncing around in my head for a few, years at that point. And one of the things that I always was thinking about was how all my friends were starting to have kids. My brother and my sister were starting to have kids. And they like, I had one friend who called me their kid called me the stamped man because I had so many tattoos. Like, I was like, oh, I want to make a book that explains to kids what tattoos are, like a tattoo book, but for children. And so that had been bouncing around in my head for a very long time. I'm like, oh, well, John Sheska, you can't just like ask him immediately. Like, he probably has people give him, like, talk to him about it. He's going to be bored by that. So I wait about 15 to 30 hangouts. Just hung out with him a lot. But eventually I say to him, hey, John, I have this idea for a kid's book about tattoos. And I try to explain my concept, and he doesn't miss a beat. He goes, well, that's not a children's book. And I am just I'm just like, oof. Like, I'm just like, hey, I've overstepped my bounds. I just burned this relationship. Oh man, I can't believe it. Luckily, 0.5 seconds later, he finishes his sentence where he says, but if you want to come over to the house every other Friday for the rest of the summer, I will teach you how to take your kind of bad adult idea and turn it into something that might entertain kids. And it took a long time. But like that education, that time was so valuable. And it eventually became a book called How to Be a Pirate, which of course goes back to the pirate shop days for sure. And it's just this story of this girl who is told she can't play pirates with the other guys. And so she talks to her grandfather, who of course has tattoos. And it's not so much a story about tattoos or even how to be a pirate, but it's of course about believing yourself. It's illustrated by the wonderful Bridget Berger. And I can't help myself. Just one fun story about this one. I laid it all out. I drew it all. But the one thing I wanted was for the grandpa to be like this old, very round, bushy mustache, like super buttoned up tweed jacket wearing guy. And then it was going to be like funny that he had tattoos. And then I saw the grandfather that Bridget drew and he is just a hunk, just a total babe, not what I had in mind. Literally didn't have a name for the book for a while. I called it Sexy Grandpa after I saw her drawings, but I was about to be like, well, I don't know. And then I saw she sent a letter along with her initial sketches, and I opened it up, and she was like, look, I know you wanted kind of more of a nerdy looking grandfather, but my father was an oil rig worker. He had a bunch of tattoos. He actually passed away last year. This is what he looked like. When I have kids eventually, this book is going to be how they meet their grandfather. I hope it's okay. And so I was like, absolutely, Sexy Grandpa it is, no problem. And that was an amazing experience. And I'm so proud of this book. And it came out right before the pandemic, but I was very lucky in that I got to do a tour like right before stuff really hit the fan. And it became a national bestseller. And I'm really proud of it. And then the last step of this is then I got stuck inside for 2 years, as we all did. Again, how's the money? Not great, but I am in like a wonderful situation. I live in an apartment that is owned by a person who's also a friend. Again, community. He's also an author, but also luck and the kindness of others kind of keeps it's the reoccurring thing in my story. And the last thing that happened was somebody approached me about publishing a collection of my essays, which meant I basically worked on that throughout the pandemic. It was way harder than I ever could have possibly imagined. But it's called Dirtbag, Massachusetts. If you'll remember, Athol, Massachusetts, AKA Asshole, Massachusetts. Turns out they won't let you call a book Asshole, Massachusetts. So it is called Dirtbag, Massachusetts. And it comes out in July of this year, because it just became 2022. So that's it. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's so much more, but I've been talking for 40 minutes and I hope I haven't bored everybody. But basically, like, the real takeaways for me are like, just to keep doing it. There's some essays in the book that I look at them now, and I know, like, that's why they literally had to take the book away from me, because I wanted to keep writing, because I knew I could write it better now than, but that's what happens. You just keep getting better, but eventually you got to let that book go so you can work on the next one. But to keep working at it, to find people that, are supportive and that you enjoy working with, and you feel comfortable sharing your work with, again, whether that's a teacher, an editor, an agent, other classmates, friends, but people that you feel okay about showing your work to, being open to feedback, but not all of it. Don't get me wrong, my friend gave me a bunch of great edits on the book. I took about 80% of them. There's certain sentences that he's like, this is over the top. And I'm like, this is art, baby. And, so, you don't take all the feedback, but taking the feedback and yeah. And like this is the story of 23 years old. I learned that you can do this, and I'm now 38. That's 15 years. That's a long time to have a collection of 12 essays come out. But I'm really happy I did it, and I'm hoping to work on the next one. Hopefully the next one won't take that long. But thank you for that. And I'm now ready to answer any and all questions. Oh, thank you for the clap emoji. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, bro.
Yeah, clapping for, well, also all the publications and successes, but just that you found your way into this. I mean, I know I have my own like interests and curiosities, but let's try to get to some of the group. You guys can just raise your hand. Or let's just unmute and talk at this point, I guess, or throw it in the chat if you're super shy.
I wanted to ask Isaac about like manuscripts. Like, when you come up with your idea, you formulate it and you write it, and you got, I guess you like put it together. How do you like shop around like your writing? Like, how does that work for you and within your community?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a couple of things here. One, just talking about the nitty gritty, like there are some great programs, just like Scribner. Is that Scribner? Is that one of the? I don't know all them all, because I'm gonna just tell you I'm gonna admit something. I don't even have Microsoft Word on my computer anymore. I like lost the payment thing. I do everything in Google Docs, but I do know there are good programs out there. The only thing I'll say about actual physical manuscripts, one, a good printer goes a long way. I love to print them out and I love to work on it that way. and two, just have a backup, because I have definitely lost a thing or two in my day because of bad laptops, et cetera, and that is always heartbreaking. But once you actually have your idea, you formulate, there's so many different ways to go about this. This is what I will say. There is no shortage of agents out there. And so the best place to start is you can talk to friends. I mean, I can even send Theo lists. I'm sure Theo has there's just they all have websites. Like, so the way I would start, the way that I've started in the past, is I think about the authors I really like and admire. And then I Google them. And you can actually Google their name, agent, and it will almost always come up. Most agents either work at, an agency, like there's a bunch of them at this one big company like WME, or I mean, CAA is more like famous actors and stuff, but they work at a big place. Or there are certain places that are like more boutique agencies, and it's an agent that has themselves, like Sheedy Literary is this wonderful agent, Charlotte Sheedy. But so you look up the writers who you admire, and you look up who their agents are, and then they will all have ways to get in contact with them. Sometimes agents close queries. They're like, hey, I'm not taking them right now. But for the most part, especially agencies, will always have open submissions. And at that point, it's about reaching out. Now, if you have a full manuscript, you can absolutely just say, hey, here's the deal. I'm a big fan of this writer who you represent. I have a manuscript here. It would mean the world to me if you would take a look. Something along those lines. But there are other ways to do that too. You can come up with a one sheet like that. I would say, like, the thing to remember is there are many, many agents in the world, but like everybody in the world, they're very, very busy, right? And so if you can come up with like a very short, snappy encapsulation of your idea, you can send them that one sheet. Then along with the like, hey, here's some of it attached. Like, and that's the other thing. Like, what I would maybe do, let's say you have a full manuscript done, right? But you have a chapter, you have a piece of it that you know that it shines, right? Maybe you just take that, you say, hey, here's my one sheet, here's what my big idea is, and here's just a sample of it, take a look. So that's just like, that is one way to do it. And listen, here's the deal. It can be so intimidating. And also, rejection sucks so much. It's funny. I realize now that I told this lovely, happy-go-lucky story. What I didn't talk about was like the numerous like rejections that I've gotten. That, hey, this isn't good enough. Or sometimes even worse, you do finish a real thing, and then everyone's like, actually, it's pretty bad. But that happens too. Like the thing, like my mantra, as basic as it is just nobody bats 1,000, right? Just nobody bats 1,000. You got to just keep going. And a lot of, just like everything in life, it's, if you get knocked down, now I'm just quoting 90s music. You know what, I'm going to just get back up again. Anyways, all that aside, there will be a lot of rejections. Here's the thing about agents. It's like, you never know. They could just be too busy. Maybe they just they don't see the vision, but that's okay. Like, just don't take it personally. Because the thing I would argue is submit. Because finding an agent's like dating, and almost to the point of like, even if the first person that says yes to you, all of a sudden you're like, I don't know if I'm getting this. Like, I don't know if it's a vibe there. Just because somebody said yes to you, that doesn't mean you have to be like, okay, yes, back. It's about finding that person that feels like a really good match, that really gets your stuff. So there are many, many agents out there. The other thing to remember, again, there will be a lot of rejection. But it's why I keep saying submit to as many people as possible. It's important not to be too precious with it. Because let's say I think of like 5 agents, right? And I only apply to those 5 agents, and I put all my eggs in that basket, and then 5, they all say no to me, and then I'm crushed, right? But if I apply to like 20 or even more, 50, like, one, it's just stats, it's just odds. Your odds get better. But 2, the other thing to remember is agents, the more people they rep, the more money they make. So they actually do have to have it, again, there might be lots of rejection. Who knows why it gets rejected? Again, they're either too busy. Their kid has a swim meet that night. Like, who knows? They just say no. But the thing to remember is, for the most part, they're trying to get as many people as possible too. So like, you can't, like, I would argue, don't be too precious with it, but also don't take any rejections personally, but don't be scared either of throwing it out there, because that's their job is to find stuff like this. And people are looking for all sorts of different kinds of writing. So that is what I would encourage you to do. And then also, again, like it's tough right now in today's climate, but maybe hopefully if this passes quickly, like book events, like going to things. There's nothing like just going to things. And don't get me wrong, it's a slow game. You know, I was a wallflower at events for years and years, but eventually you do start meeting people. You do start maybe seeing people at the same thing. You do start talking, and eventually over time, like networks can build. And all of a sudden you're like, all right, you've made friends with other writers. Oh, do you like so-and-so got represented by so-and-so? Oh, actually your guys' work is similar. Like maybe through that, you then can get put in touch with an agent. And maybe that agent is like, hey, you know what, this one's not for me, but I know somebody, like I know another agent who this is up their got. Like it is tough because it's so many people not getting back to you, but you just keep at it. And eventually I swear something kind of will work out. Again, it's a bit of a long game, but that is my rec. Theo, do you have anything else on that?
Really good advice.
If you're like, I just want to make sure you're not like, that's the worst advice I've ever heard given in my class.
No, it's really good advice. I think it's just also make sure that your stuff is ready, because that's the worst feeling, is like the woulda, coulda, shoulda of, oh, that was the agent I really wanted or whatever, and here's 6 more things that I would like to kind of change or prepare. But I'd also like want to highlight the idea of having that pitch, having that a way of talking about your stuff in a quick way to a very busy person can, I think, make a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And it can be really tough to get that. In some ways, it's better to have the pitch than even your ending, because chances, I don't know, agents, I mean, editors will definitely read the whole thing. I think agents know pretty early on if they want to rep it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and that's true too. And just to leapfrog on that, and then I know that we've talked for 12 minutes on one question, I'll shut up. But the other thing to remember is and like it's like, again, it's about making sure you've worked it enough that it is in a good place where you feel like it's ready, and like that's where you turn to your community, right? And that's why it's important to have honest people. Like, so I have many friends who are in writers groups. I know people that have been in writers groups since they were in college, and they're still in it together. And what really makes a good writers group, like, don't get me wrong, I think sometimes, I haven't been in many, to be honest. I don't know how good of a writing group guy I would be, because I'm just like, you're doing great. Like, I'm a very positive person. You kind of need that person that's going to be like, hey, I don't know if this is ready to go out yet, right? So make sure you find that person who's going to be really honest with you, because they will also be the person that's like, hey, you know what? No, this is ready. But sorry, it's also like, you also don't get so much that you never let it go either, because that's the other, you got, like, just like I was just saying, like, you got to let go of the one thing to get going on the second thing, All right, next question. I swear to God, I'll be quicker.
That was a really important thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, also social media.
That was actually going to be my next question, but I was going to let someone else go, but I actually have another one.
Okay, hang on. I'll do it. Let's go. And then we can get
to look alive, folks. Jump on in.
No, I'm ready for social. Okay, go ahead.
Alita, jump in.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of your current projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Dirtbag Massachusetts comes out on July 19th, and I'm very excited about it, but it's very scary. Let's be honest. The joke that I've been making a lot that my agent tells me I can no longer make, but I'm going to make it here, is I'm at the phase of my book where it's done and people are about to read it. A couple of people have read it early, but basically nobody's seen a copy of it for the most part. And the joke that I've been making a lot of is, do you remember when Wu-Tang album a few years back, Wu-Tang Clan made that one album that they just sold to a really rich guy for a lot of money? I was like, what if we just printed one book and like we got somebody to pay, like that way, we could cover the publishing costs, but only one person could read it, and they don't like that job. I'm like, what if it's an NFT book, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
That's it.
Yeah, no, they don't like that. Because that's what I'm really saying there when I talk about it, is I'm scared that
so short-sighted,
that people are going to see it and multiple people are going to read it. And then my other projects, let's be honest, just between us here, I need to sell a couple other kids' books before this book goes out and people read it, and I'm not allowed in schools anymore. So So
maybe you need a kid pen name, bro.
yeah. So I'm not gonna say too much of it because it's been I haven't, I'm still in the early drafting phases, but I do have my next kids book picked out that I'm very excited about. And then there is a YA project that I think what I'm working on right now is, originally I was working on something that was very just like kind of like from my childhood, very realistic based. And then I realized I messed up and put it all in the essay collection.
I was wondering. Patrick, I've heard
so
the origin story is a great
YA project to make the essay collection work. So I think I'm going to work on maybe something a little bit fantastical. Is that a real word? I don't know. That's another thing. Wasn't educated in this, just to be clear. But I think it is a little bit fantasy based, and I'm really excited about that. And then the other thing that's going to happen is something that happens when you have a book come out these days, is they usually ask you to try and write a few essays to place it at different publications to like get people, just to get, like I said, like the whole world's busy, right? Why does anybody want to care about this one little book about this kid who grew up in a weird place in Massachusetts, So they often try to place some essays to try and get stuff talked about. So I'm going to have to be working on some of that.
I know of this MFA program that has some really good fantasy YA specific workshops that, man, they're turning out some amazing writers.
Yeah, I'm gonna be sitting in.
Yeah,
I gotta be in the back of the class with like a mustache and some dark glasses,
fake nose.
Yeah, exactly. All right, but no, I'll do the social media question. I'm ready. We can do it. We'll do it quick.
Yay. So I wanted to ask, right, we're in this like really weird time where it's kind of like you have to show the entire world what you can do before people come to you, where it's like it's accessible to everybody and not just the professionals anymore. And so it's like, how important do you think it is to create like a really, I guess, like interesting concept on social media and try to like get access to agents and your audience through social media so that maybe the publishers come to you, maybe, I don't know, like through influencing or just making really creative, cute stuff on TikTok or, Watch Me Work Wednesdays or something, like people are coming up with all type of stuff now. And so I just was wondering how you feel about like using social media as a tool to find community, but also to get an agent.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think it's great for community. There's a few things that I'll always say. I think they ring as true now as they did, but you got to remember, I signed up in like 2009 for Twitter. All right. So this is weird. It took a long time is what I'm saying. One, I think it's about finding what works for you, right? There's certain platforms that work better for other people. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to downgrade myself here right now, but I don't think I'm ever gonna really do good on TikTok. But I know some other authors, and it's not an age thing. I know some other authors that are much older than me that kill it on TikTok. It's just about finding that medium. For me, I've always been kind of a Twitter person. And I do think it's a great place to, build community. What's nice about that, when I say that, this is the one piece of advice I always give. For every one thing of yourself that you share, I always try to share 3 things by somebody else. Just an essay that you read, an article, something that interests you. Just always share stuff by other people, because then that's, you start to build those communities. Saeed Jones and I originally met at a conference, but the reason we met at a conference was because we had been flirting, for lack of a better word, on Twitter for a while. I'd been sharing his work, he'd been nice about mine. So then it opens that moment for actually real connection, right? Now, as to the value of that, the joke that I always make is the internet's been incredibly important to me. I am very big, like I said, I worked on cars when I was a kid. I have friends who are now mechanics. I love mechanics. I think if I don't leave Athol, Massachusetts, I think I'm like one of those people, like I don't have kids, but they still elect me to the PTA. Like they like me in the small town, but let's be honest, I don't think I'm going many other places without the internet. So the internet really did help me reach a level that I don't think I ever would have without it. That said, that was a very specific time. And we all had a lot of, let's be honest, a little bit of naive optimism about it all. We were all about, it's going to connect everything. with maybe not some of the more tough social implications that were gonna come from it. That said, I still do think it's a nice way to, like, you follow agents that you admire, you follow writers that you admire, you interact with people. It does give you this level of access that we never would have had before, you know? Like Stephen King's one of those, I like got a box of his books when I was a little kid. I've always admired Stephen King, right? Like I never thought I would know what he thought because he can just like come on here and blurt it. And it's not like he's ever gonna notice me, but like, you know, it's just, it's this interesting thing that gives you that level of connection. But the other thing I was gonna say is like, I gotta be honest, there are people, there's just a piece in the New York Times not that long ago that was like, like people with many followers sometimes have books that don't really sell. So that's the thing. It is always a mystery. It's truly a mystery. You never really know what's gonna work. I will say that you never really, other than, let's be honest, if the work is good, if the book is good, obviously a lot of good work doesn't get the full attention that it should get. But if your work is good, that is the most important thing, right? But there are people that got book deals through Twitter, and I think there are some agents and editors out there right now who are maybe rethinking that, because a ton of followers doesn't lead to a ton of sales. That's kind of coming out. That's coming to be proven. But that's kind of on the back end of things, right? As far as I personally think about community building, reaching an audience, knowing other people, maybe catching the attention of an agent, having a little built-in audience. It doesn't even have to be that many people, but a core group who will also share your stuff when you do publish, like say an essay in some publication, I think that still goes a long way. So, but the main thing I will always say is, one, be your authentic self. You know, that means every once in a while, maybe go look at those old ones. Let me tell you, I tweeted a lot about beer and burritos when I lived in San Francisco, not tweets that made my mother proud. But you know, just like you realize that you're changing, you're becoming a different person as you grow, right? But being your authentic self, I think, is very important. Sharing other people's work 3 to 1 is very important. And then finding the platform that works for you. Maybe Instagram's great. Like you can write a lot longer actually on Instagram, right? So if you can find images, Instagram's sometimes great if you want to do those really long things, right? TikTok's wonderfully visually, and follow some author. Some of the stuff, like I don't create TikToks, but I watch them. Some of the stuff some authors are doing on TikTok is amazing. So I think for community, it's great. Does it lead to actual book sales? Who knows? But can it help you get noticed by an editor and agent still? I definitely think so.
I jumped in there. Sorry, I don't know if I was hopping in front of someone. I'm curious what you think. Like, could you kind of you're a guy who's seen a lot of like what comes out these days and sort of had a hand in a lot of sort of literary culture recently. Could you kind of like characterize what the literature of the moment is right now? Like, what would you say is on right now in literature?
Wow.
Great question, Mark.
No, yeah, but I think, listen, here's the thing. I think it's a fascinating question because it's always a fascinating question. Here's the deal. This is gonna be me on some real old man stuff. Moby Dick was a flop. Moby Dick sold like no copies. That poor Herman, he went out with not a lot of cash in the bank. And then like 20 years later, all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, it's an American masterpiece. And you know, now it gets taught, and I'm pretty sure he's got to have an estate or kids somewhere or grandkids, whatever. Somebody's
selling a lot of copies now.
Yeah, somebody's living off of Herman's good work, but it didn't, you know. So like, I think about that a lot because I think, you know, don't get me wrong, there are books that are instant classics that get spotted as such and then go on to be exactly that. But more often than not, what history has shown us is that the things that people are talking about at the day are maybe not the things that go on to last forever. And I say that as, I mean, you just said it, right? Like for the last few years, a lot of my job has been trying to find these books that I think are really, really good and speak to the moment. And so I say that, but the fact is like so many books come out every year. Like nobody can read everything. You know what I'm saying? So it's much, just historically speaking, statistically speaking, it's much more likely that there's some maybe not really talked about book that might be the thing that this time period is remembered by in like 30 years, right? And then that book even might change 50 years from then. But maybe that's probably like the person that studied philosophy in college and maybe spoke a little too much weed jumping out to get all heady like that. As to what is actually really working like right now, I keep coming back to like, I just really believe in the work. Like, I really think like it's just got to be good. It doesn't really matter to me kind of what genre or what kind of book it is. And I think one of the great examples of this is actually Colson Whitehead, who is an author. What I love about Colson, and different people do things differently. Sag Harbor, some of his early books, don't get me wrong, they're very, very good. I'm not like, but you can watch him develop as a writer through his books. If you actually sit down and kind of read all his books, and you can see how he experiments. He did a zombie book that's kind of weirdly also a love letter to New York. He did a book about an elevator repairman. Like, you know, like you watch as he gets better and better, and then you watch, you know, that come to the Underground Railroad, and then that come to the Nickel Boys, which all of a sudden he's got not one, but 2 Pulitzers. And so that's what I kind of love about Colson's career is you can watch as he experiments and tries to like find his voice, keeps improving his craft. And then what I love is his last book, Harlem Shuffle, which is again, he turned like that. It's a caper. It's a fun, like you can just tell he's having fun with it. And again, I'm sure it's a lot easier to have fun with a book after you've won 2 Pulitzers. But like he sits there and it's a romp and it's like enjoyable. And so like, I don't know, I always try to point to Colson's career a little bit as like a really good examination of a writer that just kept at it for years and years and years. And you get to kind of, because he was publishing the whole time, because some writers, you know, they only like will do 1 or 2 books, like they'll wait until it's perfect, but you can kind of watch as he progresses. You know, I personally try to, like, there's a lot of conversations around like autofiction and what's this and what's that. Like, it's something I myself try not to be guided by. Like, even I've always been the big fan of like genre walls. It's interesting, as I've gotten older, I changed it on a little bit. Like, I still think, like, I think they're important. Like, I think especially like if you're a bookseller, you need to know where to put books. You need to have sections to break things off into. But like, I just think fantasy and science fiction can be just as literary, if not more so, than some of the things that we only consider literary fiction. And I think we're seeing more of that. I think we're having a lot more kind of genre bending happening. So that might be also an answer to your question, like what is literature of the moment? I think we, you know, the Underground Railroad being a great example of that. That is like a fantastical, you know, it's a very harsh historical fiction book, but there's, you know, there's an actual Underground Railroad. I don't know, there's early drafts in it that where there was actually some time travel happening there. So you are seeing a lot of like fantasy and science fiction coming into literary fiction that maybe you wouldn't have seen a little while ago. And I think that's really fun. Like a lot of ghost stories. You know, Carmen Maria Machado comes to mind. And so, yeah, kind of almost literary mixed with genre. And then, I don't know, then there's, for me, like there's basically just like the classics. You're gonna have like that, again, that discussion around autofiction. For me, it's just like, well, that's what Hemingway did. That's, you know, that's for many, many years, writers take from their own life and then just fictionalize it a little bit. And then the other thing is that there are also people out there doing memoirs. Like, and I think, don't get me wrong, sometimes memoirs are more in vogue than not. Like the 90s, it was just money being thrown at all the memoirs everywhere, right? And then all of a sudden, kind of people had a reaction to that. All of a sudden, it's like, then in the 2000s, personal essays became really big, but now kind of people are like, maybe a little bit too much of that. So it's one of those things where it's always changing. But I think if somebody writes an incredibly good personal essay, right, it still breaks through, even if it's not quote unquote in vogue. So yeah, I guess for me, I think it really just comes down to really good storytelling. Like, cause there were times, don't get me wrong, people were like, oh, Twitter fiction. Like there's always gonna be like weird experimental stuff, right? But what it comes down to is like, if you have a really good story, I would argue like the one piece of Twitter fiction, which maybe I don't think was really that much fiction, but then got turned into that movie by the dancers, begins with a Z. Zola?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, and don't get me wrong, that's exciting, but like, all right, so what was it? But was it because it was on Twitter that well, of course, that's what helps get a lot of attention. But also, it's just like a great, like it was cliffhanger after cliffhanger. It was just like a good story. So that is not a great answer to your question, but it is the, like, basically, if you were to put a gun to my head and be like, what's the book that will be remembered right now? I would be like, I bet you it's a book that we don't even know. And that's the way it's always been. I think it's a book that's maybe not getting the attention that it deserves, but hopefully will in the not too distant future.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think we lost Theo for a moment. Theo was like, he's going to go on for at least another 10 minutes on this. I'm ready, though, if somebody just wants to shout one out.
Do you have any good Dave Eggers stories?
Yeah, I do.
Sorry, I'm just going to belt that out there.
No, that's great. So one thing I can tell you is that when I took that tour, and please, it's all just between us, but I raised my hand and they explained what the papers were. I raised my hand again and I said, what's McSweeney? Like, I didn't know, I hadn't read Dave at that point. I was like, who, what? And I think at that point in their time, they were getting a lot of people who were there just to kind of meet him. And so in a way, they like looked at me as this, like, they were like, oh, you are a real idiot. and you're not even here for that. Great. And I think some of the workers really were delighted by that. And that kind of helped me become a member of that community even quicker. That then said, I met, he was absolutely delightful. He was a wonderful boss. And the one story I will share here that was is eventually I do, though, get a job to come to New York. So I leave the organization and he gave me a big hug and he said, be sure to check out Times Square. I hear it's really good. I think he thinks I was being, he's a big, listen, he likes the West Coast. He likes the beauty there. And I think he thought I was being a little bit of a ridiculous person to be moving back to the cold East Coast. So he's like, check out Times Square. That's it. Listen, not to keep yapping. I think it's got its charms as somebody that's spent a little bit too much time at an Olive Garden in Times Square. It's got its things. Sorry, Theo, go ahead. I was just telling stories.
No, it's great. So I had a little meltdown situation, so I'm just going to stay muted. And
no problem. Hi. Hi.
Hey, Isaac.
Yes. Hello.
Hello. So, essay writing, right? I wish your book was available prontissimo. And talk about like risk taking in terms of exposing certain things that are gonna get you in trouble for exposing, but it's your fucking business to expose it.
One, great question. Two, thank you for your excitement around the book. I feel like it'll be here before we know it. Yeah, this is the tough question. This is the really hard question. This is where I say the first thing that I ever got paid to write was when I was like 25, and it was a personal essay that definitely had some sexual exploits in it, and that, I was already estranged from my parents at that point, but my dad definitely didn't talk to me for 6 months. Then he called me and was like, we talked about baseball and pretended like we never happened, like good New England fellas. But for me, it's always hard. It's always hard. It hasn't gotten easier. I'll say that, right? I am now 13 years or whatever from when that essay got published, and I'm still a little worried about how different people are going to take things in the book. From a pure logistics standpoint, what I try to do is, one, anybody that's written about in the book, if they are somebody that I'm still in contact with, who maintaining a relationship with is important to me, I've reached out to them and I've made sure, and I make it very clear. I basically say, I'm not promising I'm going to change what's in this, but I want you to see it first. I'm open to hearing feedback that you have. I'm not saying that I'll act on it, but I'm open to hearing it. And I just it's important to me. And that goes a very long way. Instead of somebody just clicking on something and all of a sudden they're reading about themselves and they're just like, what the hell? It's hard, but I'm telling you, I think you will be surprised how positively people react. I have oftentimes shared something where I'm like, oh, this person's gonna be so mad at me. And they read it and they're like, hey, you know what? I'm okay with this. Like sometimes they're like, I like this. Sometimes they're like, I think you were way too easy on me. You never know how they're going to react. But I think people, I think people in general like to know that you were being thoughtful. So I think that's always helpful. Oftentimes in that, if somebody's like, hey, I'm uncomfortable, like I always change names unless somebody specifically asks me to leave their name, which does happen sometimes. I always change names. Again, if it's somebody I'm looking to maintain a relationship with, you don't want to put them on blast too much. I will often change characteristics. But then there are those things that are too big and you can't change, my mother and my father are who my mother and my father are, and they did what they did. And I won't lie. I'm in a situation right now where I have probably the best relationship with my parents as I've had my entire life. And I'm very lucky. A lot of people that are telling stories like I am, I think the parents in their life or the people in their life who were doing those things are often like, that's not how it happened. My parents are actually, they acknowledge it, which is pretty wild. I think it's just dawning on them that there's a difference between, just like it's dawning on me to have finished a book and have other people read it. They're like, there's a difference between acknowledging it and knowing that like their neighbor can pick up a copy. And again, like I don't name them. I've been very in conversation with them for a while, kind of being like, hey, we should have a little, like I basically want to give them a little distance so they could be like, oh, that's like a cousin in the family. That's a weird, we don't. The nice thing in that department, sorry, I'm kind of rambling here a little bit because this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Like the other thing is like, and I hope I'm not jinxing myself here, I'm gonna knock on wood, but the fact of the matter is most people aren't gonna read this book. That's just the God-honest truth. Some will, but like, I think I try to have conversations with them that are like, hey, look, it's a thing. It's going to be out there. We can prepare for all sorts of different developments. But at the end, like, oh, what if your neighbor? I know your neighbors, and they're wonderful, but this is such a small little thing that's happening in such a big world, So I try to kind of be kind in those ways. And then the next thing is really about, are you ready to share it? And I think that's when it becomes a conversation that's just, just for you. Or maybe you and a therapist, or you and a very good friend. And it's tough to figure out like why you're telling the story you're telling, I guess is what I'm trying to say here, because I think for a long time a lot of my writing was me just trying to communicate with my parents, and I didn't really know how to. Some of those conversations didn't have to be in essay, they could have been letters, they could have, right? So there's something to that, right? But I've never regretted anything that I've published. Even this is whatever, weird all adult, like the first piece it was about having sex with my partner while they were wearing a strap on when I was like 26, so like it's, I think, and it's like a wild thing to put out there. And I think my parents were quite shocked in that moment. I don't regret publishing it though, because that piece then leads to other things that then, I'm like I said already, there's some essays in this collection I look at right now that are still a little weak in my mind. But the fact of the matter is you gotta just let it go and be done with it, so you can kind of move on to that next one, And so you kind of grow, you learn along the way. But the main thing I would say is, one, having the conversations with the people you care about and you still want to maintain relationships with. If there are people you just kind of want to burn to the ground, I would still suggest changing things. You don't want to be writing from a place of malice. Two, then really checking in with yourself and trying to, what is it that I'm trying to communicate with this story? Why Why is this something that I'm going to reveal? Because there will be, you know, some wonderful moments where you're going to have somebody read your work and they're going to say, holy crap, I connected with it in this incredibly powerful way. And that's going to feel amazing, right? But there might be people that are like, hey, what the hell? Or I don't agree with this. Or, you know, you're putting your heart on a sleeve out there and somebody's like, well, I don't really like the way this is written. There's a lot of vulnerability involved in the art form that we've all chosen to pursue. And so if you have those conversations with yourself, and again, or with a therapist or a close friend first, you'll probably be like better mentally prepared. Because this is the last thing. I'm rambling a little bit, I know, but the thing that's so important to me, and I've heard this from other people, so I'm just like passing this one along. This is not an original. You finish the thing, but it's not you. So it's also about separating yourself from the work. You finish the essay, you finish the story, you finish the novel, you finish you finish whatever it is that you're working on, you're putting it out in the world. The thing about reading that I love about it is it's an interactive art form. People are bringing their own memories, their own images. What you describe, they're seeing it totally different than what you're thinking of. They're filling in with their own pictures, their own things. They have their own politics or their own thoughts on things. They are building almost something different with your writing than maybe what you set out to build. But that's okay, because it's not really yours anymore. And the nice flip of that is when somebody tries to tear it down or make you feel bad, like the fact that you are not the book, you are not the essay, you are not the piece. It is a separate piece of art that you have then let out into the world, and it is not you. And that is a way, while this is a very vulnerable art form, that is a way to protect yourself a little bit. You can just remember, you know, the work is important. We're all here because we really believe in it and we love it. But the work is not everything. It's not you. You know, you're a separate entity than that once it's done. I don't know if that made sense, but
Yeah, and you know, your the dulcet tones of your good sense and talking has soothed the savage beast that is this meltdown. So I'd like to thank you for just being here and being yourself. I really appreciate it.
it's a really nice way to say that I put your kid to sleep.
No. Now, if you know any parents who are dealing with meltdowns, that is like, if you could reliably make one go away, you are a saint on earth, my friend.
Yeah. No, and no lie. Shout out to all parents right now. But seriously, thank you all so much for having me, listening to me blather on for so long. I hope at least some of it was helpful. That's the other thing, take what's useful, leave the rest. That's the same thing that I say about other people's edits or feedback. There's always you don't have to take it all. Take what's useful, leave what's not useful to you. But thank you all so much for listening. Best of luck. I'm sure we will run into each other again. I do stuff with Theo and at St. Francis all the time. Hopefully there will be stuff coming up too, so.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
And thank you for your questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Say bye-bye.